So as I'm sure you guys have seen by now, the NBA has granted the Bulls their $10.2 million disabled player exception for Lonzo Ball missing the entire upcoming season, which for those wondering what that means, it gives the Bulls an additional $10.2 million as an exception to spend going over the salary cap. Think of it like the mid-level exception, the biannual exception. There are exceptions to going over the cap that a team can use, and in this instance, Lonzo Ball is still going to be getting his money, and it's still going to count on the books for the Bulls and their overall cap sheet, but it gives the Bulls a little more flexibility to sign some players on the free agent market. That said though, as we all know, I don't think I even need to remind you at this point, in order for the Bulls to actually use the disabled player exception, they would most certainly be going into the luxury tax, which the Bulls have only done one time in their history. So the question now is, yes, the Bulls have been granted the disabled player exception from the league, but will they actually use it? And if they do, what do their options look like? Well, let's talk about it. So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Now, to be clear, as it stands right now, with the guaranteed contracts the Bulls have on their books, they have around $8.5 million in tax space, not cap space, because the Bulls are already over the cap, but we call it tax space because the Bulls are essentially hard capped at that amount given the ownership's unwillingness to pay the tax. So $8.5 million in tax space with 3 roster spots available. Now, this does not include Dosunmu, who is still without an offer sheet from another team or the Bulls. We're going to assume that he signs the Bulls qualifying offer of $5.2 million. I think it's unlikely he's going to be getting a larger and longer term deal from another team. If he does, though, that does throw a wrench into everything because the Bulls will either have to match, making their tax space even more limited, or they have to let him walk and lose him for nothing, which, as much as Io struggled last season, is still never good when you lose a young player who does have talent and upside potential. But for now, we'll assume he signs the qualifying offer at $5.2 million, which leaves the Bulls with $3.3 million in tax space for 2 roster spots. Now, the reason I say this is because in order for the Bulls to use the $10.2 million exception, they will need to go into the luxury tax. There was only $3.3 million left in space before hitting that line. Now, of course, they don't have to use all of the $10.2 million, but they also do still have some money to use the mid-level exception and even the biannual exception, given the only players they added in free agency were Javon Carter and Torrey Craig, both on cheap deals. AK did say in his end-of-season exit interview that he does have the green light to go into the tax, but then did also add that ownership has been willing for them to go into the tax if they are a competitive team and have a shot at contending. I think he specifically said, well, if we're looking at top 4 or top 6 in the East, which at no point were the Bulls there last season. But who knows? Maybe that can change by adding on the margins, getting some shooters. I mentioned before, the Bulls lost 17 games last season by 5 points or less. Being last in NBA in three-point shooting is the difference maker in that. With adding guys like Carter and Craig, who are capable three-point shooters, that can shift the whole dynamic for how many wins they could potentially walk away with. But point being, the Bulls are not going to be willing to go into the tax as they currently stand, which would mean not using the disabled player exception, at least for now though. You see, the Bulls can still use that further down the line in season, even after the trade deadline, if they pick someone up off of the buyout market. So depending on how the season goes, maybe they shock everyone and they're a top 4 team in the East. I find it unlikely, but who knows? And ownership says, yeah, we feel we have a shot here. Let's beefing up the roster, use that exception to bring in a missing piece or 2 before going into the playoffs. If the season goes just as it did last year, or even worse, hopefully not, then not a chance in hell that they use the disabled player exception, because why would you pay the tax for a 10-seeded team in the East? Not going to happen. So in my personal opinion, I don't see them using the actual full disabled player exception to Lonzo Ball before the season. They did this more to have it in their back pockets depending on how the season goes and use it if needed later on in the year. But what if they surprised everyone? Because all of us fans have been complaining nonstop about how cheap the ownership is, even though I think they could really care less how much we whine about it. They're still raking in millions from the team, so it's no skin off their back. But let's say they do the unthinkable and they use that full $10.2 million that they have at their disposal. Who would they go after that is still available on the market? And surprisingly, there are actually some good options. Now keep in mind, there are some rules and stipulations around using the disabled player exception. You can only use it to sign a player to a 1-year deal, or if it's through a trade, it would need to be a player on an expiring contract. So a lot of restricted free agents who are out there likely aren't going to be working because they're going to be looking for multi-year deals. Guys like PJ Washington, that's out. But some names that do come to mind that you might be able to get on a 1-year deal are as follows. Christian Wood. Yeah, a player who has his flaws. Some people call him an empty stats guy, but say what you will, he was still a solid scorer for the Mavericks last season. Can crash the boards, is athletic, versatile when it comes to his ability to finish at the rim, but also a decent pull-up game. It would complicate things for the Bulls a bit because they already have signed Torrey Craig, which gives the Bulls an option at the 4. They already have Vucevic and Drummond at the 5, so where does Wood fit in the front court when you already have starters and backups at 4 and 5? I guess you can move Patrick Williams to the 3, which he played in his rookie season, and have him come off the bench behind DeMar DeRozan. So the fit overall by bringing in a guy like Christian Wood is questionable, but it's an option. And I do think Wood would take a one-year deal at $10.2 million, given cap space is dried up for most teams, and he's likely going to want a one-year deal to play for a bigger contract next season. Then there is Kelly Oubre. I've always said he's one of these players that is super athletic, very talented, very streaky scorer, but is also one of the lowest IQ players I've seen in the NBA when it comes to shot selection and decision making down the stretch. It's part of the reason why he's been a journeyman throughout his career and still remains a free agent as of right now. But at 27, still in his prime, not afraid to shoot the ball, averaged over 20 points per game last season, although on pretty bad efficiency. To have him come off the bench as another scoring spark with Coby White is not a bad option for the Bulls as long as they can temper and manage his touches, his minutes, and his shot selection. He's not going to have free reign like he did on the Hornets if he were to join the Chicago Bulls. Another guy, and this is probably one you could use for a vet minimum deal, so you probably wouldn't need to use the disabled player exception to go into the tax, so just using this one as an additional option, and that's Nerlens Noel. Noel has struggled with injuries, but a good shot blocker, decent rebounder, gives the Bulls some rim protection, which they need. Again, not saying it's ideal, but it's a big you can pick up for cheap that you could use as an option when Drummond is making some boneheaded plays. There is also Kendrick Nunn, if you wanted some additional scoring and athleticism, decent at shooting the ball from 3. Hell, the Bulls could just re-sign Javonte Green. I wouldn't be opposed to that, as he's always been one of my favorite players with his hustle and effort and always being in the right place at the right time. There's also TJ Warren, Will Barton, hell, Bol if they want to take a shot at him. I mean, a lot of these guys are going to be going on minimum deals, but the point is here, they would have options. The Bulls would have options. But really the two biggest or best options, I should say, for the Bulls and for players that you could get on one-year deals that would be more than the minimum for which you could use the disabled player exception on are Christian Wood and Kelly Oubre. Players that would be in the rotation and could provide impact more so than these fringe rotational players that will likely be seeing vet min deals. If I had to choose between one player to go after using that exception, I would probably take a chance on Kelly Oubre. It could backfire because usually he's a net negative when he's on the court, but the Bulls need shooters. Oubre, very streaky shooter, like I said, inefficient, but he also isn't afraid to shoot. Man shot 7.2 threes per game last season. That's more than anyone on the Bulls, including Zach Lavine. And to have another scorer off the bench when the Bulls struggled to put up consistent scoring in the second unit would be a plus, in my opinion. But I would love to hear what you guys think, though. Let me know in the comments. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.